I think it's always good when interpreting a passage of Scripture to be real honest. And I think if most people were honest upon reading God's speech, their initial reaction is something of confusion, if not even disappointment. They expect something a little more conclusive than what they seem to get. Job, of course, has been mourning and lamenting his suffering, his pain. He has been complaining bitterly, and regardless of what you think of that, you do know that he was afflicted not because of some sin he committed, but because he'd been trying to be righteous. And God finally comes and answers him. What do we see in God's answer that superficially looks quite disappointing? Well, I would say, first of all, a lot of it just seems to be natural history. He talks on and on about stars and clouds and lions and ostriches and so forth. And so you don't expect that, you don't really get a sense that that's the answer to Job's concern about the justice of God. Secondly, God at times, now this is reading it perhaps harshly, but I'm just talking about how emotionally one might respond to the reading. God at times seems almost to berate Job for the fact that Job is a small, frail human being. God constantly says, "Can you do this? Were you there? Do you know this? Do you know that?" And Job, of course, has to say, no, I'm not that powerful, I'm not that smart, and all that sort of thing. And so Job seems to be, to a degree, berated for his humanity and for his limitations. And then 3, not everything God says is altogether new. Now, some of it is quite new, but not all of it. Well, I should say, not all is new. There's a good deal here that we have encountered before. Job himself gave speeches talking about the power of God and God's control over nature and these sort of things. So it's hard to see how God suddenly talking about his great power and his control over nature and all the forces of the universe would be a new thing. Now, superficially, God's answer to Job is one simple point. In all 4 chapters, it's one simple point. Job, I am more powerful than you. I am omniscient and you are not. You are in no position to tell me how to run the world. As I say, that's a superficial, and by superficial I don't mean wrong, I mean obvious interpretation of what God says. And it is correct. These texts do say, Job, I, God, am omniscient and omnipotent. You are not. You cannot do the things I am doing. I know what I'm doing. You don't. And you're in no position to tell me how to judge and how to rule the universe. Now, as I say, that is a correct interpretation. It is obvious. But I would suggest that beyond what is obvious, there are much more profound things going on. And that's what we want to try to get to. So, these 3 points again were 3 points that make the speeches of God seem disappointing. He spends so much time with natural history. He seems to berate Job, and a good part of what he says is not altogether new. Let's consider the outline. The speeches of God are in 2 parts. First, they speak primarily of nature. And this would be 38:1 to 42. 40 verse 2. And this can be broadly divided into two parts. Inanimate nature, which would be stars, storms, and things like that. And this is 38:1 to 38. And then animate nature, that is, the animals. And this would be 38:39. To 39:30. After that, you have God issuing a verbal challenge to Job, and Job responds. God basically says, okay, you've heard what I've had to say. What's your answer? And Job says, well, I really have nothing to say. So challenge and response. God's challenge, Job's response, which is 41 to 5. The second half of God's speech is what I would call supernature. Meaning, these are things you do not encounter in your ordinary interaction with the natural world. You can see the stars, you walk on the earth, you can touch the sea and so forth. You can see lions and ostriches and hawks and all that sort of thing. These are things that are beyond normal human experience. So just for simplicity's sake, I call them supernature. And this would be chapter 40, verse 6 to 41:34. And again, you have three parts. Well, 41:34. No, I should actually, let me correct that. That should really be 42:6. 42:6. 46 to 42:6. Three parts. A, behemoth, which is basically the rest of chapter 40, 7 to 24. Am I getting that right? I may have a verse off. 40, yeah, well then, dress for action, yeah, 47 to 24. Then Leviathan. And that would be basically chapter 41. 41, 1 to 34. And then Job's response. God doesn't issue a challenge, Job just responds. And this is 42, 1 to 6. Now, before I go any further, you may notice this is seems a little different from the initial outline I gave to you, the whole book. You remember I gave you the whole book as a kind of chiastic structure in which you have at the beginning Job's affliction, chapters 1 and 2, and then you have Job's response in chapter 3, where he curses the day of his birth. And the counterpart to Job's cursing the day of his birth, I put as 42, 1 to 9. And I think that's correct. But the point is, a biblical text is a very complex, and it functions on many different levels. There are structural elements that relate to one another that it's not always just kind of like a pristine package in which every verse has a single function within this outline. You can have elements that on one level structurally relate to each other, but also function structurally as part of a different package. And so 42:1-6, I think, is the counterpart to 41:5. That's pretty obvious. But I also regard 42:1-9 as Job's second response to his situation, the counterpart to chapter 3. His initial response, cursing the day of his birth, chapter 3. His second response, 42:1-9, which we will look at as we go ahead. So that's the basic structure of the passage. We've looked at things in the passage that kind of confuse and even perhaps disappoint readers when they read these chapters. Broadly speaking, what is going on within this text? It is important to understand God is rebuking Job's theological conclusion. He is not rebuking Job's life. In other words, what is the premise and foundation of the book? The foundation of the book is that the wise hold to a doctrine of retribution. This is one more time through something we've gone through every day. The doctrine of retribution: God punishes the wicked, God rewards the righteous. This doctrine is true insofar as it goes, but it's not the explanation of everything. Job is a righteous man who is afflicted of God. Therefore, his affliction cannot be explained by the doctrine of retribution. Job is still operating within the framework of the doctrine of retribution, and he therefore concludes that God's justice is miscarrying, that God is not judging correctly. If God judged correctly, he would know that Job wasn't guilty, and therefore he would not afflict him. The problem is, of course, that whole approach to solving the problem, that whole framework for solving the problem, is wrong. And no amount of argumentation you give, no amount of sophisticated reasoning will ever be able to square that circle. In other words, if you try to resolve the affliction of Job strictly within the framework of the doctrine of retribution, it's impossible. Because the doctrine of retribution has nothing to do with why Job was afflicted. This, in part, I would say, is what makes God's answer seem unsatisfactory. When you come to it and you read it, you are looking for God to somehow integrate retribution into a grand theory of justice and explain it along those lines, certainly after you've been reading through, something like 35 chapters of this argument going back and forth between Job and the three and then Elihu. And you get something totally different. So it makes the book of Job, it makes God's answer seem almost irrelevant. I mean, all this stuff about lions and horses and thunderclouds. What does it have to do with the situation? Well, again, it is because we approach it with the wrong sense of understanding of what's going on. Now let's begin just by, let's go through 38:1-38 and just observe the kind of thing God talks about here. This is where he's discussing inanimate nature. All right, so God begins and he makes his little introductory statement in verses 2 and 3. And he tells Job to stand up and get ready because he's going to have it out with him, have a straightforward argument with him. And then he begins his real argument in verse 4. Verses 4 to 6. Again, save my voice and give us all a little variety. I'm going to ask you to read these verses. Would someone read verses 4 to 6?
Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone?
All right, so here he talks about the foundation of the earth. And notice the language he uses is all the language of stability. He speaks of foundations, he speaks of bases, he speaks of cornerstones. These are all things that, of course, are metaphors drawn from architecture, and they are things that make a building fixed and stable. So the first thing he talks about is the earth, and again with emphasis on how God made it fixed and stable. Now would someone read verses 7 and 31 to 33? Verse 7 and 31 to 33.
When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy.
31 to 33.
When you bind the chains of Pleiades or loose the cords of Orion, when you lead forth a constellation in a season and guide the bear with her satellites, do you know the ordinances of the heavens or fix their rule over the earth?
All right, now here the focus is on the stars, and the emphasis is on the regularity of the stars. The text in verses 31 to 33 refers to several constellations that translators believe refer to the Pleiades and to Orion and to the bear, the Big Dipper. But regardless of whether those specific identifications are correct, these are constellations that move through the sky, that have a fixed place in the heavens, and their movement across the sky is orderly and predictable. So once again, he's speaking of the stars, but he is speaking of them as being set in a fixed order. And would someone read verses 8 to 11?
Who shut the sea with doors, when it burst out from the womb, when I made clouds in garment, and thick darkness his swaddling band, and prescribed limits for it, and set bars and doors, and said, thus far shall you come, and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stayed.
All right, so here he is talking about the sea. But once again, notice the focus of the text. It is on setting the sea in a fixed place. Now, of course, the sea is by nature kind of chaotic because it's water. And water is by nature unstable. But the text talks about how God has set a place for it. It originally burst forth as from the womb. So, all this water came crashing out, so to speak. And it is, again, by nature chaotic. And often in ancient Near Eastern texts, the sea is a metaphor for chaos and even death. But here it is set in a fixed place, and it cannot escape this boundary. So again, it is the stability and the fixedness of the sea that is the focus. And would someone read verses 12 to 15?
Have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the day to know its place, that it might take hold of the skirts of the earth, and the wicked be shaken out of it? It is changed like clay under the seal, and its features stand out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and their uplifted arm is broken.
All right, now here he describes the dawn. This is sunrise. 4. The dawn. On the one hand, it draws upon imagery that is very common in ancient Near Eastern literature and in the Psalms, and also it is a very beautiful portrayal of dawn. We have here a picture of sunrise. So the sun is coming up. It hits the skirts of the earth, which would be the horizon. You know, the light begins to glow on the horizon. If you had to drive in early this morning, as I did, you saw the horizon beginning to glow as the sun began to hit the hills. Changed like clay under a seal. Well, what does that refer to? Of course, in the ancient Near East, they typically would, their signature was a seal. They would have a little signet or a signet ring or a little seal stamp. And you would have a little lump of clay, and you would have a seal inscribed with your personal insignia. And when you were affirming an agreement, like ratifying a contract, you would put your seal on that clay. And what had been just a formless lump suddenly took on shape. It had very sharp edges. If you've looked at these seals, by the way, a little short aside here, if you've never been to a museum, a great one if you're from the East is the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. If you can go to a museum that has a Mesopotamian collection and see their seals, they are exquisite. First of all, they're tiny, little tiny face to it, and intricately carved imagery and often like cuneiform script. I mean, incredibly sharp, incredibly beautiful. And you would put that in a clay, and what had been a formless mess suddenly has definition. And the analogy is to seeing the landscape as the sun comes over it. So, you know, you stand and you look at the hills when it's still dark, and you see nothing. You see something you can vaguely make out as, you know, bit kind of lumps. But as the sun hits it, suddenly it takes on definition, and it becomes very sharp and very precise. And that's a metaphor for the dawn striking the earth. Moving on, in this metaphor, he speaks of the light shining upon the wicked. Now, this is really, although it is in a sense it speaks of God's judgment on the earth, this is certainly not the major focus of the text. This is kind of a standard understanding of the dawn and the beauty of the dawn and the power of the dawn in ancient Near Eastern texts. It is understood that the darkness is when the wicked do their deeds. You know, they go out at night when people can't see them, and they break into houses or they steal cattle or stuff like that. And the dawn kind of chases them away. So it is a way of again exalting the beauty of the rising sun. So what we have here is a description of the dawn, and again, this is something that happens with regularity. It is again a fixed event. Every day, at a fixed time, the sun comes up, the darkness is chased away, and you see the world. All four of these, therefore, speak of things that are fixed because God made it so. So if you want to just describe this as a whole, these four elements, things that are fixed, set, because God made it so. Why is this important? It goes back to Job's conclusion. Now remember, God is rebuking Job for his conclusion, not for his life. And Job's conclusion, when he considers how he has suffered, though he's an innocent man, is there is no moral order in the universe. Everything is in moral chaos in the universe. And God is saying, look, you look upon the world and you see how everything is fixed and stable and regular and dependable. You walk on the earth and you know it's not suddenly going to turn to water under your feet. You know that the seas aren't suddenly going to jump out of their boundaries and cover the earth. You know that the sun is going to come up. You know that the stars are going to be fixed in their places in the sky. And God is saying, why do you think that is? It's because I made it that way. So what God is really saying is there is a fixed order in the universe, and He did it. So He's saying to Job, I know all about setting things in order, putting things in their proper place. I know what it is to have a situation that is chaos and turning it into something that is fixed and regular and dependable. And so his real answer here, what is underneath all of this, is he is telling Job the world is not chaos because God made it that way. Without God, it would be chaos. Now let's continue on looking at some of God's answer. Would someone read for us verse 16, 38:16?
Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep?
All right, he asked Job if he has gone into the watery deeps. So these are sometimes, poetically the fountains of the earth or the depths of the ocean. He asked Job, have you gone into the deep sources of water? And verse 17, would someone read that?
Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness?
All right. So now he asked Job if he has ever been to the underworld or perhaps Sheol. These two probably are kind of melded together in this imagery. That's verse 17. Verse 17. So again, he speaks of entering the underworld, the realm of the dead, or Sheol, but at any rate, the deep, dark places of earth. So notice, just in these two, he's spoken of the watery deeps, and he's spoken of the subterranean deeps. And would someone read verse 18? Verse 18.
Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Declare if you know all this.
All right. He asked Job if he knows the full expanse of the earth. Have you traveled it from end to end? Do you know all of its places? And would someone read verses 19 to 21?
Where is the way to the dwelling of light, and where is the place of darkness, that you may take it to its territory, and that you may discern the paths to its home? You know, for you were born then, and the number of your days is great.
Now when you look at this, he asked Job if he has been to the origins of light. Which if we were to speak of this, we might think of it in terms of the physics of energy or something like that. But basically he's saying, do you know, again in our terms, the energy source where light comes from? Do you know the source of the power that energizes the whole universe and gives light to all of the universe and so forth? So the very origins of light. I guess I should put the verses in here. Thus far we've looked at 16, 17, 18, and 19 to 21. And one more, verses 22 to 24. What is that?
Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I have reserved for the time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? is the way to the place where the light is distributed, or where the east wind is scattered upon the earth.
All right, so here he speaks of the origins, basically, of weather patterns, origins of severe weather, to put it very prosaically. He speaks of storms and thunder and lightning and so forth. So basically, in our terms, the storing up of energy in the atmosphere that gives rise to all these powerful storms. Now in these five, what do we have? What we have are, I would describe them as distant and dangerous places to which Job cannot go. Within all of these is the idea of kind of origins and the idea of great seething power. Perhaps the one that's a little bit exception is the expanse of the earth, but we'll talk about that too. But you have the watery deeps. You know, the kind of fountains of the earth way down deep that surge up water. And of course, Job could never go down to those. You have the underworld or Sheol, the deep, deep places of earth. Job could not go to that. You have the mysteries of the origin of energy and light. No, Job could not enter into that. And you have the atmospheric and energy patterns, as we would call it, but the sources of the power that gives rise to storms. We'll come to the third one again in just a moment. But all of those speak of what? They speak of places no human can enter, and that they are powerful. They are dangerous. You know, it's like nuclear power. It's something that is explosive. It's something you have to really know what you're doing if you're going to handle it. And God is saying to Job, look, all of these powerful origins of water and the foundations of earth and the origins of light and thunderstorms, do you know anything about that? Have you ever been there? Job, of course, says no. But the point is, God is saying, I am handling very powerful, if you will, primeval entities. I am handling things that are of great primeval power. Things that a human cannot even approach, doesn't really understand. Things that really are behind all of the earth and everything that happens on the earth. I control all of that. So again, we go back to Job's conclusion. His conclusion is God has not managed the world rightly. The world is a chaos. It is a moral chaos. God says, what are you talking about? I handle the most powerful, fundamental elements of the universe. Things you can't even imagine. I know how to keep the world in order. I know how to bring order out of chaos. Now the third one there about the expanse of the earth, I think the idea is, you know, if you think of how an ancient person would think about the world, they would think of the world, distant horizons, as probably being very strange and very dangerous, and at any rate there are places they couldn't get to. So they would think of, you know, if you go far enough, there's no telling what kind of weird people and weird beasts you're going to run into, what kind of terrain that you've never seen before. Their idea of traveling to the distant, to see the whole expanse of earth would be seeing things that to you would be very strange and very dangerous. And what God is saying to Job here also, again, is I'm surveying the whole of the earth. I see everything in it things that to you would be very weird, very dangerous, and I'm managing all of it. So again, everything here is talking about God's ability to maintain order in the universe. Now we have a few more verses from chapter 38 we want to look at. Would someone read verses 25 to 28? 25 to 28.
Who has cleft a channel for the torrents of rain and a way for the thunderbolt, to bring rain on a land where no man is, on a desert in which there is no man, to satisfy the waste and desolate land, and to make the ground sprout with grass? Has the rain a father, or who has begotten the drops of dew?
Okay. And also, would you read, because it's on the same theme, verses 34 to 38?
Can you lift up your voice to the clouds, and a flood of waters may cover you? Can you send forth lightning that they may go, and say to you, here we are? Who has put wisdom in the inward parts, or given understanding to the mind? Who can number the clouds by wisdom, or who can tilt the waterskins of the heavens, when the dust runs into a mass and the clods stick fast together?
All right, in both of these two little passages we've read, God is speaking of thunderstorms and the rain that comes. So, thunderstorms and rain. And again, these are verses 25 to 28. 25 to 28, and also 34 to 38. And now would someone read for us verses 29 and 30?
From whose womb comes the ice and the frost of heaven? Who gives it birth? The waters harden like stone, and the surface of the deep is frozen.
All right. So here we have a portrayal of winter, the freezing of all the elements, and also ice and snow. So you could say winter and ice and snow. And again, this would be verses 29 and 30. And this is actually the last of the verses from chapter 38. What do we have here? I would describe it as things that are chaotic, that God actively controls. So, of course, thunderstorms and the sending of rain is something that happens all the time and in an unpredictable way. It's not like dawn, where the sun comes up the same time basically every day. And it's not like the stars that are in a fixed path over the heavens. You don't know when storms are going to come. And, of course, wind and water, again, air and water, are by nature chaotic elements. And so you've got this constant chaotic force raging within the earth, and God is managing it. He can send it when He wants to send it, or He can restrain it when He wants to restrain it. Another thing is variations in the temperature. Now, of course, winter is regular, but the coming of cold weather is somewhat unpredictable. You don't know exactly how or when it's going to come on any given year, on any given date. And it is, again, certainly to the ancient person, a very strange and mysterious force. Someone living down in the ancient Near East, in the southern area where Israel was, or in Edom, or in that whole general area, they wouldn't see snow real often, but they would see it. And they wouldn't have freezing temperatures a lot, but occasionally they do. And so, very strangely, suddenly everything freezes. which would to them be a dramatic kind of shocking event. So again, these are powers that are ongoing, that are active, that are to some degree unpredictable, that God controls. He sends them when He wants to send them. And the point is, there are all kinds of powers in the world that God has to control, and He knows how to do it. Now, before we go any further, let's just put all of this inanimate natural history in context over against Job's complaint. Job's complaint is, of course, really a moral complaint, but all of this stuff from nature, from inanimate nature, is really answering that. Job sees a world where wicked people often prosper, and they get rich, and they get powerful, and they have many children. He sees poor people who are oppressed, who are starving. He looks at himself and the suffering that's come upon him himself. And again, he says, God doesn't seem to be in control. Chaos has won. And all of this essentially serves as an object lesson for God to say to Job, I know what I'm doing. Yes, there are chaotic powers out there. And certainly human evil is a chaotic power. But I know how to manage it. It looks to you like it's totally out of control, but it's not. Okay? So that's how far we've come thus far. Now let's get into what God says about the animals in the end of chapter 38 and the beginning of chapter 39. And the choices He makes, the animals He refers to, would be to us quite surprising, I would think, and it's something we need to think about carefully. All right. Chapter 38, verses 39 to 41. 38, verses 39 to 41. Would someone read that for us?
Hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions, when they crouch in their dens, or lie in their thickets? Who provides the raven its prey, and its young ones cry to God for help, and wanders about for lack of food?
All right. He begins in 1 with lions, first of all, and then ravens. And the passage again is 38, 39 to 41. Now, first of all, remember that lions in this kind of ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature are used as metaphors for evil. Lions are violent, they're dangerous, they're vicious, they eat people, they eat sheep, and so they are metaphors for wicked people. Certainly lions are carnivores. Ravens are often scavengers, and again eat dead animals. So he begins at a place that I would think, if God's talking about how He's just managing the world, he begins at a place that one might seem surprising. He talks about the most violent of animals from the standpoint of ancient Near Eastern literature, the lion. And he's a carnivore. But notice he doesn't say anything negative about the lion. Elsewhere in Job and in other wisdom literature we've looked at, the lion will be spoken of as something that God is going to judge, and God will break his teeth, and God will destroy him. Not here. What does God do? He feeds him. For all of his power and his abilities as a hunter, he is essentially another animal that is dependent upon God. So you have this great carnivore who in God's eyes is simply one of his animals that he needs to feed. Now look at chapter 39, verses 1 to 4. Would someone read 39, 1 to 4?
Do you know when the mountain goat gives birth? Do you observe the calving of the does? Can you number the months that they fulfill? Do you know the time when they give birth? When they crouch, bring forth their offspring, and are delivered of their young? Their young ones become strong. They grow up in the open. They go out and do not return to them.
All right. I should have said, when he speaks of lions and ravens, he's basically speaking of, meat eaters, flesh eaters, whom God feeds. Now we come here to 39, 1-4, and he speaks of mountain goats and deer who give birth in a hostile environment. So what is he describing here? He is describing the animals that might be thought of as the victims of the carnivores. The victim of the lion, and whose body would perhaps be eaten by the raven, and so forth. These are the prey, these are the hunted, and they are in a very hostile environment. And of course, they are at their most vulnerable when they are pregnant and giving birth. And of course, the little baby animal is really vulnerable. So you have these victims that are in a very hostile environment, and yet God brings them through it. So if you can think in terms of the human metaphors, you've got the hunters and you've got the hunted, and God watches over all of it. God is protecting them. God is bringing them through. In this chaotic world, God is seeing to it that everybody thrives. Everybody survives. The lions live, the goats live, the deer lives, the raven lives. He's managing the whole thing. Next, would someone read for us 39, 5-12. 39, 5-12.
Who has let the wild donkey go free? Who has loosed the bonds of the swift donkey? To whom I have given the arid plain for his home, and the salt land for his dwelling place. He scorns the tumult of the city. He hears not the shouts of the driver. He ranges the mountains as his pasture, and he searches after every green thing. Is the wild ox willing to serve you? Will he spend the night at your manger? Can you bind him in the furrow with ropes, or will he harrow the valleys after you? Will you depend on him because his strength is great, and will you leave to him your labor? Do you have faith in him that he will return your grain and gather it to your threshing floor?
All right. So here we have, first of all, the wild donkey and the wild ox. The wild donkey and the wild ox. And the thing you notice about the wild donkey and ox is they thrive apart from any human guidance. They live apart from the world of human beings. They don't plow their fields and they don't eat at their mangers, and yet they thrive anyway. So you can say they thrive without human involvement or interaction. And this would be, again, verses 5-12. Now, think back to what we talked about when we spoke of kind of the three different types of wisdom. Wisdom just as a skill or intelligence, and that really doesn't come to play here. Wisdom in terms of governing the world according to, a fixed order that humans understand, and then the hidden wisdom of God. Well, what we're really talking about here is number 2, and the fact that human beings conceive of the world as only being a safe place when everything is in order and every beast has been put in its place. So, out in the wild there, it's dangerous, it's crazy, it's chaotic. But if you have a donkey who's domesticated, an ox who's domesticated, he does his job, you do your job, and everybody's safe. Everybody is living together in a human environment, controlled by human wisdom, human knowledge. God is here speaking of animals that live totally apart from human beings. They don't need them. They don't want them. They don't want to plow their fields. They don't want to eat from their mangers. They don't want to be involved with humans. They have no need for human involvement or interaction. What would this imply to Job? We're going to look at all of this in a little more detail later, but what it would basically imply to Job is there are things that thrive and there are things going on in the world apart from your wisdom. Again, Job wants to put everything in a fixed order because in this sense he's just like the 3. God is saying, well, there are things that happen that are apart from your fixed order. And I think that's the point here. Verses 13 to 18, to many people seems to be almost useless, and a number of people call it comical. I think it may be the most important part of these 2 chapters. Would someone read verses 13 to 18?
The wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but are they the pinions and plumage of love? For she leaves her eggs to the earth and lets them be warmed on the ground, forgetting that a foot may crush them and that the wild beast may trample them. She deals cruelly with her young, as if they were not hers. So, though her labor be in vain, yet she has no fear, because God has made her forget wisdom and given her no share in understanding. When she rouses herself to flee, she laughs at the horse and his rider.
All right. So here we have the ostrich, verses 13 to 18. The ostrich. Now, the thing about the ostrich can be said very simply: she has no wisdom. And again, this is 13 to 18. Now this is almost a revolutionary concept from the standpoint of wisdom literature. First of all, what does it mean to say that she has no wisdom? What is the illustration here? The illustration is of how ostriches abandon their eggs on the ground, or at least seemingly abandon them. I don't know that much about actual ostrich natural history. But I have seen ostrich eggs on the ground where they're just lying there. They lay their eggs, they're not up in a tree, they're not concealed. You can see them just sitting on the ground, which would seem to represent extreme neglect. And that's the idea of it. This is an animal which is so stupid, it just exposes its young to everything. Just leaves this egg out in the middle of the open. And so, anybody could take it, anybody could smash it or do whatever. But surprisingly, ostriches are still here. They haven't gone extinct. And they're strong and they're powerful and they run around and they see other wild animals and it doesn't mean anything to them. They're not scared because they're so powerful. They're so fast. But the really important thing is this is an animal without wisdom, and yet it thrives. Now again, we're talking about that second variety of wisdom here. And this is almost a revolutionary concept because, when you look back again to Proverbs 30, even the animals have wisdom, right? The animals store up grain for the winter. The badgers put their homes up in high rocks where they're safe. You have all these different examples of how even the animals behave wisely. But here's an animal who's just totally devoid of wisdom, at least in terms of the illustration. But what is the point of it? The point is God is saying to Job, Job, you think everything has to be governed according to the world as you understand it. And again, Job understands the world according to our second category of wisdom. For him, that's everything. And God is saying to Job, there's a lot going on you don't understand. There are things that thrive totally without your wisdom. So again, this is not really given for comic relief. This is a very, very important passage because what it is saying to Job is his wisdom is limited. His wisdom only applies to human beings in this world in under certain categories. But it doesn't govern everything. And there are things that are beyond the wisdom that is allotted to human beings. Now we come to verses 19 to 25, 39, 19 to 25. Would someone read that for us?
Do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane? Do you make him leap like the locust? His majestic snorting is terrifying. He paws in the valley and exults in his strength. He goes out to meet the weapons. He laughs at fear and is not dismayed. He does not turn back from the sword. Upon him rattle the quiver, the flashing spear, and the javelin. With fierceness and rage he swallows the ground. He cannot stand still at the sound of the trumpet. When the trumpet sounds, he says, "Aha!" He smells the battle from afar, the thunder of the captains and the shouting.
All right. Now, the obvious animal here is the horse, and specifically like the war horse. He is described, of course, as very powerful, brave, having great, so to speak, athletic ability, being able to jump and to run, fearless, all these things. What's really going on with the horse? This war horse is so powerful and so kind of gifted with courage and strength that he can withstand human violence. Notice all of the violence that he faces is made by humans. Javelins and spears and so forth. What's that? That's war. So he's able to withstand human violence. Now, of course, that doesn't mean he's invulnerable. Horses are not invulnerable. But it does mean he can acquit himself very well in the face of human warfare and human violence. And again, that's verses 19 to 25. What would be the lesson here? Again, Job has spoken of the ferocity of the wicked and how they oppress the poor and how they are ravenous and unchecked, and that their violence and their greed crushes everything in their sight. God is saying, in effect, I can make even an animal strong enough to withstand human evil and human violence. If I can make an animal that can survive and thrive in a world of human violence, I think I can handle everything else. So again, everything God is saying relates to Job's conclusion that God is refuting. Before we finish up, one more section left. Before we finish up, what I'm trying to get you to see is you can read this superficially and it just says, okay, God is powerful. He made the lions and the goats and the donkeys and the horses, and they're all strong, and this shows how strong God is, and God is saying to Job, are you that strong? And Job says no. God says, well, there you go. And that's true. That superficial analysis is not incorrect. But it is only superficial. There's much more going on here, and all of it, both in chapters 38 and 39, relates to how God is able to maintain order and manage all the chaotic forces that Job thinks are out of control. So let's do the last one, verses 26 to 30. Would someone read that?
It is by your understanding that the hawk soars and spreads his wings towards the south. Is it at your command that the eagle mounts up and makes his nest on high? On the rock he dwells and makes his home, on the rocky crag and stronghold. From there he spies out the prey, his eyes behold it from far away. His young ones suck up blood, and where the slain are, there is he.
All right. Notice, by the way, Jesus alludes to verse 30. The end of the Olivet Discourse, where the carcasses are, there will the eagles be gathered together. So it alludes to this verse, but of course Jesus is also speaking of the eagles of the Roman legion. But that's a different story. What do we have here? Hawks and eagles, the great birds of prey. And this kind of really goes back to the lions and the ravens. These are powerful predatory birds that God has equipped gloriously. They can soar to the heights. They can make their nests at the highest rock. They can, from the very heights, see their prey, hundreds and hundreds of feet below, see a rabbit. And they can swoop down and grab it, and where it is, they take it to their young, and they suck up the blood. So these are predatory animals whom God has gloriously equipped. Created, equipped, whatever. And this is 39, 26 to, 30. Now, what would be the point of this? The point would be Job looks upon all of these forces as somehow being terrible, as being evil, as being dark. In fact, God looks upon the eagles. He doesn't think they're terrible at all. He made them. He looks upon the eagles and sees how high they can fly and how keen their vision is and their ability to hunt. And it's a glorious thing. It is a work of God. He made the rabbits too, that the eagles hunt. And both of them thrive. Both of them survive. But the point again is over against Job's view of the world, that chaos is winning out and things are just terrible. God says, well, no, it's not that way at all. Let's see. What I want to do is give you a summary of what's going on in these first 2 chapters. So this will be a quick summary of what I see happening, or the meaning behind 38 and 39. First, it refutes Job 3, which is where Job really sets out his basic case, and everything else is just commentary. When Job curses the day of his birth and calls upon the world to be uncreated and undone, he's basically saying, well, the world is just chaos anyway. And so let it all be engulfed in darkness. And God says to Job, what are you talking about? The world is in complete order. I'm managing everything. I'm feeding the wild beasts. I am managing the storms. I've set the earth in its place. The earth is not in chaos. It is in complete control. 2. It sets a limit to wisdom. Now again, it doesn't say the book of Proverbs is wrong. Everything in the book of Proverbs is true. In fact, I need to give you another quick little excursus. You know what, I should have done this really more at the beginning of the class, the first day of class. I talked about how, in my view, there are these 2 broad categories of literature. There is election literature, everything that concerns Israel and the fact that God chose it, and their history and their destiny and their relationship to God and all that sort of thing. And then there's the wisdom literature. Well, within wisdom literature, there are kind of a couple of different categories. There is Proverbs. Proverbs is Wisdom 101. It is what you teach to who? The young man. My son, listen to me. You are giving him his basic lessons in how the world works. And it's all true. This kind of wisdom is available everywhere. Lady Wisdom, she calls out to people. Everything she says is true. If you embrace violence, you will die a violent death. If you embrace sexual promiscuity, it will ruin you. It will destroy you. If you're lazy, you'll go hungry. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, knowing how to live in this world and everything. Everything in Proverbs is true, but it is Wisdom 101. It is the basics that you give to a young man to teach him how to live. In Ecclesiastes and Job, you have something quite different. In Ecclesiastes, you have a reflection on the futility of wisdom and on the inevitability of death. And this is obviously a very quick summation. But the point is, no matter what you do, you can be as wise as you want, you can be as rich as you want, you can be as successful as you want, you can have political power. I mean, these are things he focuses on: wisdom, wealth, political power, and so forth. It's all destined to die with you. And so it's a way of saying, well, if this is how life really is, what should you do? And the full exegesis of Ecclesiastes is a major task, but the basic conclusion is fear God, for that is the whole duty of man. Job likewise deals with a thorny issue. Job deals with the problem of theodicy, where Ecclesiastes deals with the problem of death. And in Job, you have, again, this big question Job raises: if the doctrine of retribution is true, and God is judging the world, how come we see evil seeming to flourish everywhere? Right? The second point here of my little outline is that the book of Job sets a limit to this kind of wisdom. As a general rule, everything in Proverbs is true, but there are things going on, things that God is doing that are beyond just Wisdom 101. So again, it is not denial of Wisdom 101, but it's saying there are things beyond that. 3, and this may be a surprising lesson, but it is germane. God cares about nature. And of course, the things he celebrates are the things that people tend to find frightening. Lions, predators, very powerful animals, non-domesticated animals, all that sort of thing. And God is in effect saying, what do you mean the world is out of control? You've got all these incredibly powerful animals. I made them all. I feed them all. I manage them all. Nothing's out of control. And so God's care about nature is another way of saying life is more complex than we tend to think of it as. And related to this is the speech of God is not anthropocentric. That is to say, centered on human beings. We tend to think of storms as bad things if they hit us, right? I mean, a really bad storm, not a storm that gives necessary rain, but a storm that causes flooding or something like that. It's bad if it hits us. If it hits somewhere where we're not, we don't care about it, right? I mean, if it hits just someplace completely isolated where no people live, it's not evil. If it hits where people are, it's evil. We think of a great hurricane as being a great evil because it kills a lot of people. If a big hurricane hits an island that nobody lives on, we don't call it evil. Our viewpoint is totally anthropocentric, but everything in this passage is really just about how God deals with the natural world apart from humans. Humans only enter in 2 levels. As domesticators of animals, to which God says, well, there are a lot of animals that really don't need you because I've equipped them to live without you. And as warriors, humans as agents of warfare and violence, in the picture of the horse, in which God says, I can make a horse powerful enough that he can even enter into that most horrible of all things, human warfare and violence. Notice what he says about the rain. Back in chapter 38, find my place where it is. Here we go. Verse 25, 26, chapter 38, verse 25, 26. God says, who has cleft a channel for the torrents of rain and a way for the thunderbolts to bring on rain on a land where no man is, on the desert in which there is no man. Now again, we tend to think of rain totally in anthropocentric terms, namely as it relates to agriculture. It's a good thing when it waters our crops. It's a bad thing when there's too much of it and it floods our land. But God says, you know what? I'm just managing all of nature, even nature that has nothing to do with human beings. I'll send rains on lands where there's not a single living man. And so, again, God is looking at Job and saying, you think that everything in the whole universe relates to you, and that something is good or bad just because of how it relates to you. Well, guess what? I'm managing a lot more than just human beings. Fifth, and this will require some real unpacking, it is not like Egyptian cosmology, or wisdom? So this I got to unpack a little bit. There are two things in Egyptian cosmology and wisdom that relate pretty clearly to Job. I'll come back to this, but I want to give you my two things. One is the Egyptian conception of the world as red land, black land. Whoops. Ugh. Black land. Red land, black land. As the Egyptians looked at the world, they said, basically, there are two places. And of course, they're being very Egyptocentric. But they, of course, lived in the Nile Valley. Like, here's the Nile Delta, and you go down and you have the Nile River. The Nile River, of course, every year would have a flood. The flood would cast soil up upon its banks where the flood was. It would leave this layer of alluvial soil, very rich, fertile soil. And that would be the black land. That's where people lived. That's where they farmed. The land gave crops, and it was good. So actually, when you speak of Egypt, it's interesting. Other than the delta up here, and of course this is the Mediterranean Sea, other than the delta up here, all of Egypt is about 500 miles long and about 5 miles wide. Okay? Outside of that was bare desert that they called Red Land, where no human being could dwell. And in their view, the black land were where the gods of order dwelt. Gods like Amun-Re and Horus, Horus, the falcon god. The good gods, the gods of order, managed the black land. And of course their representative Pharaoh managed the black land. Out in the red land, it was the domain of evil gods, gods of chaos, like Thet, S-E-T-H. And so in their cosmology, you basically have two worlds. You have the world of chaos, governed by evil gods, chaotic gods, and the world of order, governed by good gods, including Pharaoh. What is God saying in this passage? He's saying, I'm over everything, the Lord. I send rain where there's no people. I manage lions and ostriches. Everything in the world is under my control and domain, and nothing is out of my order. That's the first thing. The second thing is the Egyptian concept of Ma'at. M-A-A-T. Ma'at. Ma'at is usually translated as something like order, and the idea of Ma'at is closely related to what I just said about the black land. The ideal of Ma'at is, the ideal situation is one in which everything is in its proper place. Everything is governed properly. So human society is under Pharaoh, and above him the gods, and below him his administration. Human beings are farming the land. Everybody knows his place in society. Every year there are crops. Everything functions smoothly from year to year to year because there is an ordered structure called Ma'at. Ma'at, by the way, is also personified as a goddess. She's not the same as Lady Wisdom in Proverbs chapter 8, but there is an analogy. In both cases, it is this sense that there is an order to life that must be maintained, and everything depends upon that. So in both cases, whether you're talking about red land, black land, or the concept of Ma'at, you have the idea that there is a kind of wise order to life. Everything that is in harmony with that wise order is good. Everything that is outside of that is bad and is chaos and is destructive and is evil. Now, let me back up and say one more time, properly understood, the basic concept of wisdom is right. Yes, we do have to have order in our lives. The book of Proverbs is all about that. Yes, if you go against the order that God has built into the world, you will destroy yourself. That's all correct. But in reality, the world is more complex than that. So again, where the Egyptian would look to the desert, to the red land, and say, there's no Ma'at there. That's the domain of gods of chaos. That's all evil. Yahweh, the Lord, the God who speaks in Job 38-41, says, I'm in control of all that. I'm managing everything. And a lot of it you think of evil because it's dangerous to you. Again, the anthropocentric principle. But God says, in fact, a lot of it's really pretty amazing when you consider how the eagle can soar and so forth. So it is set against this Egyptian cosmology and wisdom. Let's see, that was point 5. Do I have any more? I have one more. Yes, one more point. And this is perhaps the most important one of all. It is not like the demonic theology of Job 4. The vision of Eliphaz. What did the spirit who came to Eliphaz say? He said, God looks out at all of creation and it's impure in his eyes. Even the angels he charges with error. And then when Eliphaz elaborates on it, and Zophar and Bildad, they say further, the heavens are impure in God's sight. The stars and the moon are dark in his eyes. And as we've explored, they basically have the attitude God hates the world. And if God hates the world, there's nothing he hates more than human beings, who are the vilest thing of all. And yet God, again, speaks of all these forces and all these powers and all these predatory animals, all these wild animals, storms. And God doesn't speak of it as something really horrible. In fact, there's a beauty to how he speaks of it. So God doesn't hate the world. Let me just say a word about Job's response, and then we'll break and come back and look at Behemoth and Leviathan. Job's response, chapter 40. God asks, so are you going to contend with the Almighty? If you're going to argue with God, give me your answer. Verse 2. Job answers, behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I answer once. I will not answer twice. I will proceed no further. So Job just says, I'm already convinced. And so the text could have ended there. But it doesn't. It goes on to Behemoth and Leviathan, because Behemoth and Leviathan will give us an entirely new lesson that is very important. So it's quite interesting and important to notice Job is convinced, but God wants to keep on talking because God has still something very important to say that he hasn't said yet. The only other thing I'd say about Job's response is, I think Job gets it. Again, we tend to read this just with the superficial understanding. God says, I'm big and powerful, you're not. And Job says, well, you're right, so I guess you know what you're doing. And that is true. It's not that that's wrong. But I think in all these illustrations, and Job is a very smart guy, I think he gets it. God is really saying your whole conception of the world being out of order and your way of evaluating the world, your way of evaluating life and seeing darkness and chaos everywhere is completely wrong. I am in control over everything. I am managing it properly. And much of what you say is terrible is really quite good. To summarize and to finish this part of the lecture, again, the spirit of Job 4 looks upon the world and says, as far as God's concerned, it's dark, it's nasty, it's terrible. God says, he looks upon the world and says, it is very good.